Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome back to part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 15, Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. We left off in part 1 talking about solar cookers and how we can use the sun to cook our meals. Now we're going to head out and talk about how solar cells can produce electricity. So photovoltaic cells, otherwise known as PV cells, convert solar energy into electrical energy. So if you remember in part 1, we spoke about solar cells and how they can be used to heat water, that could produce steam, that could produce heat. That's a little different than photovoltaic cells. So what happens with regular solar cells that just take the sun's energy in? Sun's energy comes in, heats usually again water, which then gets converted into steam, which then turns a turbine, which then produces electricity. Photovoltaic cells or PV cells convert solar energy directly to electrical energy. There is no water that needs to be turned into steam. There are no turbines that spin. Basically, it takes the sun's energy and converts it directly into electricity that then can be used. So the design of solar cells: sunlight hits the cells and produces a flow of electrons. Systems then can be connected to existing electrical grids or to batteries. And again, those electrons basically as a flow of electricity, and then that electricity can be put into electrical grids or could be stored in batteries for a later use. Solar cells are made of paper-thin, rigid, or flexible sheetings. They have been enabled by nanotechnology and other emerging technologies. The rural use of solar panels actually can power LED lamps. And there have been some solar-powered microgrids that have either been out there or have been envisioned for rural areas that have a hard time getting electricity. So again, these solar cells, obviously the problem with them is they have a low energy efficiency, a low net energy right now, mainly because they're so expensive to make. So again, it's that initial cost that is so high, and that's why they have a low net energy yield at this point. But again, scientists and engineers are developing more efficient cells. Again, I say it to you, someone who's going to be out in the workforce in just a couple of years. If you can come up with a cheap way to make photovoltaic cells to convert solar energy right into electricity, I have a feeling you're going to be a very rich person. So again, these are just some of the emerging technologies that you guys can be in on the ground floor here. Solar cells have become the world's fastest growing way to produce electricity. And what are we seeing here? This is actually a solar cell, a photovoltaic cell that's on a hut in rural India. And basically, this solar voltaic cell here has enough power to basically provide lighting inside that hut for these folks. Again, their only initial cost was that cell. Now the sun produces all the light that they need in their home. And again, low net energy yield because that cell is expensive right now. But if we can get those photovoltaic cells to be cheaper, well, then obviously that net energy yield would increase. So here's our favorite chart that we like to look at: trade-offs from solar cells. Advantages: little or no direct emissions of carbon dioxide and other air pollutants. They're easy to install, move around, and expand if needed. And for newer cells, there are some competitive costs that are beginning to drive down the cost of those cells. Disadvantages: obviously, you need access to the sun. So if you don't have that a lot, could be a problem. You need some kind of electricity storage system or backup to be able to use the electricity on cloudy days that you've stored. Again, low net energy, but likely to improve as our technologies get better. And solar cell power plants could disrupt desert ecosystems. We did speak about that a little bit in part 1. So again, obviously, here, trade-offs of those solar cells, pros and cons, definitely understand those. Okay, so we talked about the sun, solar, renewable energy. Now we're going to head on out and talk about wind power or wind renewable energy. What are the advantages and disadvantages of using wind power? Well, wind is one of the fastest growing, least expensive, and cleanest ways to produce electricity. Wind is actually an indirect form of solar energy because if you remember from your earth science days, uneven heating and Earth's rotation causes the wind to blow. It's really that uneven heating. The rotation causes a deflection of the wind to the right right in the northern hemisphere, a deflection of the wind to the left in the southern hemisphere because of the Coriolis effect. But it's really that uneven heating. Some parts of the earth are cold, some parts are warm, and that causes the wind to blow. Kinetic energy is captured by the wind turbines. So we have turbines grouped together in wind farms. They can be on land or they can be at sea, right? The wind comes in, spins the windmill, right? That then goes into a turbine, which then spins, and that turbine produces the electricity, which then goes out into the grid. That's what you're seeing here. Again, wind turbines convert the kinetic energy of the wind. Again, kinetic energy, energy of motion. So the wind is moving, right? Turning these big windmills, right? There you have a gearbox, the electrical generator turns the generator, that produces electricity, and then the electricity can go out into the grid and can be used in people's homes. All right, so how does it happen? Again, tall, long blade turbines can extract more energy from the wind. This is a rapidly growing power source because it is very efficient at this point. United States, China, and Germany seeing the fastest growing wind as a renewable power source. The future is going to be offshore wind farms because the wind doesn't really stop over the ocean, right? There's very little friction, and as a result, your wind speeds are fastest over the ocean. So that's where you're going to find the most wind to produce the most energy. Wind power has the potential to produce 40 times the world's current electricity used. Therefore, if we can figure out, and everyone can do this with wind, we'll have more electricity than we could possibly need. Again, 40 times more than we would possibly need. So once again, when you hear bad things about wind power, you really need to parse through the data because, again, it is very cheap at this point, rather effective. And really the main issue is people don't want to see these things in their backyard. I mean, that's really one of the main issues with the wind power. People don't want to see them. They're not aesthetically pleasing. And again, that could mean why offshore might be the best place for these potential wind farms. Wind is abundant, widely distributed, and inexhaustible, meaning it's never going to stop. And it's mostly carbon-free and pollution-free. There's that high net energy yield because, again, those windmills aren't super expensive to put up, right? It's really simple. Blade turns, converts that motion into electricity, goes into the grid, right? Largest potential areas are usually rural, okay, because that's where you're going to have at least the land that you would need to create or to put up these big windmills. And you need a smart grid that's needed to be connected to them. Also, backup power source may be needed just in case the wind does die down. But what's an alternative? Large number of wind farms in different areas connected by a smart grid. So when the wind is blowing in Vermont, we use their wind power. When the wind is blowing in New Jersey, we use their wind power, right? We kind of switch it up because it is a smart grid. So again, things to think about as you get out into the workforce. And again, maybe do something in environmental science, in environmental engineering. So once again, our favorite chart, understand the pros and the cons of wind power so you can use them on an FRQ. Advantages, high net energy, widely available, low electricity cost, little or no direct emissions of carbon dioxide and other air pollutions, and they're easy to build and expand. Disadvantages, need backup or storage system when the winds die down and less connected to a national smart electric grid that we can move the electricity sources around. Again, it is visual pollution for some people. Some people don't want to see these in their backyard. There is some noise, low-level noise, and that does bother some people as well. And yes, they can kill birds if not properly designed and located, even though, again, that is a rather minor issue, even though it is a disadvantage. So again, pros, cons of wind. The key here, a high net energy yield. So again, wind power may be the way to go. All right, moving on. Again, we're touching on all the different types of renewable energy in this chapter. So we just spoke about solar, just spoke about wind. Now we're going to head in and talk about geothermal energy. This is energy from underneath the ground, Earth's own heat energy. And in some parts of the world, it is being tapped to actually produce produce resources, right? Produce energy for us. So geothermal energy can supply many areas with heat and electricity. There's a generally low environmental impact. Problem is there's a limited number of sites where it can be produced economically at this point. You need a place where you have a lot of heat near the surface, right? So where is that going to happen? Usually where you have a lot of earthquakes, a lot of volcanic activity, things like that is where geothermal right now is the cheapest to harness. But again, technologies, here you go, yet another area. If you can figure out how to more cheaply tap the Earth's internal energy supply, again, that could make you a rather rich person. So what is, again, geothermal energy? Is heat stored in the soil, in underground rock, and in fluids in the Earth's mantle. Geothermal heat pump system uses temperature difference between the Earth's surface and underground. Fluid is carried through a closed loop. This can heat a building in the winter and can actually cool it in the summer. So that's what we're looking at right now. These are basically how this geothermal energy works, right? So basically you have this pump, and it's, again, we're using water, and we're pumping water down into the ground, right, where it is hot. So when the water gets down into the ground, it heats up. It then comes back up into the home, and that hot water can be used then to heat the person's home. Same thing can happen in the winter time, in the summertime, except it's a little different of a process. Here, you pull hot water out of the house that goes underground. If you don't go that deep, the ground can be a little cooler, right? So that water actually cools off and then comes back into the house as colder water that can be used to cool the home in summer. So again, geothermal can work both ways. You can get heat from the Earth's surface to heat water to go back into a home and heat the home, or in the summertime, it's a little bit cooler underground. Maybe you don't go as deep, right, for the summertime pump, but the summertime pump, then the water goes underground, it cools off, then comes back in the house, keeps the house cool. So again, this is a way that some parts of the world are beginning to tap this geothermal energy. So basically, we need these hydrothermal reservoirs. They're dry wells, and they extract dry steam, wet steam, or hot water. The United States is the world's largest producer of these, but drilling these geothermal wells is expensive. So that's the problem right now. In Iceland, though, it is used exclusively. If you know Iceland, though, they are right on a divergent plate boundary, right, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So they have a lot of tectonic activity. That means a lot of heat right near the surface. So it's cheaper for them to get it. And in 23 other countries, it is used exclusively as well. But again, usually in areas where you have a lot of plate tectonic activity, which again causes that magma or that warmth, underground warmth to kind of come up to the surface. Think about the geysers that you get out in like Yellowstone National Park. That would be an area in Montana that you could potentially use geothermal power, because again, those geysers are being heated, and so you have hotness underneath the ground, though, but rather close to the surface. That's the key. We don't have that necessarily here in Ardsley in the New York City area, so again, would be much more expensive, as you would have to drill down much, much farther. So what are we looking at here? This is basically a power plant in Iceland near the Blue Lagoon. That's what we're looking at here. People basically bathing in this warm water. Where's the warmth from that water come from? Right, all the tectonic activity underneath the earth there in the Iceland area. What happens for this electricity, right, is hot water or steam is pumped under pressure to the surface, right? That hot water in there then creates steam that then turns a turbine that then produces electricity. Steam from the turbine then condenses into water and is pumped back down into the reservoir, the geothermal reservoir, where it can be heated up again by Earth's natural processes, and then that hot water can move back up. And here is basically a power plant in Iceland that is producing electricity from underground geothermal reservoirs. So again, it is possible. It is being done. It's just, again, you need these geothermal reservoirs to be closer to the surface, and that doesn't occur everywhere at this point. But again, could be a real nice way. So once again, finishing off the little section on geothermal energy with one of our favorite charts. Advantages: it has a medium net energy and a high medium net energy yield and a high efficiency at accessible sites. So again, here in New York, it wouldn't be high net energy, but in Iceland, it definitely could be. Lower carbon dioxide emissions than fossil fuels, and low operating costs, again, at favorable sites where that tectonic activity is happening right under the ground. Disadvantages, high cost, except at those concentrated and accessible sources. So again, right now, most of the planet, it would be you would have a low net energy yield here because of the high cost. Again, a scarcity right now of suitable sites. There aren't that many, but that's because the technology is not as good. So as we get better technology, there may be more sites that become more suitable, and there is some noise and some carbon dioxide emissions that folks would have to deal with. But again, geothermal could be the wave of the future. We'll have to see. Again, something else you can potentially get in on the ground floor in a couple of years when you get out into the workforce. Okay, next we're going to talk about biomass. What is biomass? Biomass is just a mass of biology. So basically, we're talking about wood here, okay, in essence, right? We're talking about maybe some liquid biofuels, all right? So what is solid biomass? It's potentially a renewable resource. It requires large areas of land, and exceeding replenishment rate produces a net gain in emissions of greenhouse gases. So what does that mean? That means if we cut down more trees than we replace, right, we are losing that way that carbon gets sequestered, or one of the ways that carbon gets sequestered out of the atmosphere. So if you're going to cut down a tree to burn, definitely plant another tree, and then you're fine. Liquid biofuels can lessen the dependence on oil. Biofuel crops can, however, though, degrade soil and biodiversity and increase emissions. Okay, so what we're talking about here is like corn ethanol. Okay, we thought that maybe these biofuels like ethanol would be the wave of the future, but what we're finding is that, again, what did we talk about when we talked about sustainable agriculture? Planting miles and miles and miles and miles of just corn is not good for anything, and that's what we're kind of seeing now, and that's why these biofuels may not be as great of a fuel source as we maybe thought. So biomass, again, any plant material or agricultural waste that can be burned for fuel. Biomass plantations have fast-growing trees and shrubs that are repeated for harvest. Wood pellet production, however, degrades forests. Burning wood and other forms of biomass does produce carbon dioxide and other pollutants. But what was the key to this was back a couple of hundred years ago, this is how people would warm themselves, right? They'd burn wood. However, they would only cut down a couple of trees, right? So there always were more trees being grown than there were cutting down. So you never had an issue with extra carbon dioxide, extra pollutants in the air, because the trees were still around to sequester them. The problem is now, if we clear cut a forest and use that wood to burn biomass, now all that carbon dioxide is going into the air, but we've taken away the trees that sequester the carbon dioxide, and that can lead to an increase in those air pollutants, in those greenhouse gases. So that's the issue. If you're just burning biomass, like mom and pop farms back in the hundreds of years ago, no problem. The problem is now you try doing it on a mass scale, and that's where issues come with the environment. So again, not a lot on biomass, but here is our chart, advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, with this chapter, guys, really hone in, especially on all these charts that you're seeing with the advantages and disadvantages of the different types of renewable energy. So advantages, widely available in some areas, moderate cost, you have a medium net energy yield, no net carbon dioxide increase if harvested, burned, and replanted sustainably, right? So I cut down a tree and burn it, but I plant another tree, then you're fine. If you don't do that, then you are going to have an increase in carbon dioxide. And plantations can help restore some degraded lands if you do those plantations on degraded lands. What are disadvantages? It contributes to deforestation. Clear cutting can cause soil erosion, water pollution, and loss of wildlife habitat. We spoke about that. Can open ecosystems to invasive species. And you can increase the carbon dioxide emissions if the biomass is harvested and burned unsustainably, which again is what you're seeing here with the clear cutting of forests. So once again, biomass, know your pros and your cons. All right, moving on to liquid biofuels. Again, ethanol is ethyl alcohol produced from plants. Biodiesel is produced from vegetable oils. The advantages: crops can be grown throughout the world. There's no net increase in carbon dioxide emissions under certain circumstances, and the biofuel is easy to store and to transport. Brazil makes ethanol from sugarcane residue, which has a medium net energy. In 2014, 43% of the corn produced in the United States was used to make ethanol. Corn-based ethanol has a low net energy. Producing and burning corn-based ethanol adds 20% more greenhouse gases than burning gasoline. Think about that, guys. Again, we thought this was going to be the key. It's not. And 43% of the corn is being used to produce ethanol and not being used to feed people. So a couple of chapters ago, we talked about food production. We talked about how many people in this world are malnourished, right? Undernourished. Well, we're wasting all this corn to produce a fuel that produces more greenhouse gases than burning gasoline. So again, we thought this was going to be the wave of the future, and maybe it is not. Again, growing corn requires a lot of water, right? We're talking now about this intensive agriculture that we've learned in a previous chapter doesn't work. Ethanol distilleries produce large volumes of wastewater that then needs to be discarded up. Cellulosic ethanol is an alternative made from inedible cellulose. This can be made from grasses that do not require fertilizer or replanting, so that may be a little better. And algae can also produce biofuel, which is a little better. But again, we don't really know how to do this on a mass scale yet. And so once again, what are our trade-offs? Disadvantages, advantages of liquid biofuel: reduced carbon dioxide for some crops, medium net energy yield for biodiesel from oil palms, medium net energy yield, ethanol from sugarcane. Disadvantages: fuel crops can compete with food crops for land and raise food prices. Fuel crops can be invasive species in an area. Low net energy yield for corn ethanol and from biodiesel from soybean. And you can actually have higher CO2 emissions from corn ethanol than you would from gasoline. So again, biofuel, maybe not the way to go, but again, here are your advantages and disadvantages. Definitely understand both. All right, moving on to hydropower. That's the power of water, right? Water flowing over dams. Tidal flows and ocean waves can also produce hydropower. Downside: environmental concerns and limited availability of suitable sites. We spoke about dams when we spoke about water resources. We spoke about how dams aren't that great for biodiversity and for the environment. Obviously, you need dams in many cases to produce the hydropower. And so again, not great for the environment. So what is hydropower? Again, very similar to wind, except here you're using the kinetic energy from moving water, right? Again, once again, though, an indirect form of solar energy. Right now, it's the world's leading renewable energy source is hydropower. Top three producers: China, Brazil, and the United States. Hydropower supplies half of the electricity used on the west coast of the United States. So again, what are our trade-offs? High net energy yield of hydropower. Large untapped potential. We got a lot of rivers, a lot of tidal waves, tidal oceans. We'll talk about that in a second around the world. So there's a lot of potential out there. It's a low cost electricity and low emissions of carbon dioxide and other pollutants in temperate areas. Disadvantages: large land disturbance and displacement of people when you have to create huge dams like this, which then create huge reservoirs behind the dams. High methane emissions from rapid biomass decay in shallow tropical reservoirs. And again, it disrupts downstream aquatic ecosystems. We spoke about that in a previous chapter when we spoke about water resources. So a way to maybe do it is to use the tides and waves to produce electricity, right? And every day the tide comes in, the tide goes out basically 4 times, right? You get 2 high tides, 2 low tides every day at any one location on planet Earth. And that flowing water in and out could spin turbines that could then produce electricity. So coastal bays and estuaries, all right, are where this would happen. You have some tidal energy dams in France, Nova Scotia, and South Korea. Challenges, though: few suitable sites. Very high cost at this point, even though, again, maybe something you guys could figure out in a couple of years to make the cost lower. And equipment damage from storms and saltwater corrosion. Saltwater is terrible for most things when it gets in there, because the water evaporates, leaving all this salt that then you can't, machines basically just shut down. So that's an issue as well. You constantly have to replace and fix the equipment here. But again, could be a way to get hydropower from this tidal work. Okay, so our last thing I believe we talk about here is using hydrogen as an energy source. So again, the dams, I believe they had a pro and con in a previous chapter when we talked about water resources. So that's why there wasn't one of those charts about dams, about hydropower. Again, you know the routine, you kind of understand the issues there. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of using hydrogen? This is just hydrogen now, all right? So hydrogen is the simplest and most abundant chemical element, right? We have it all over the universe. It only has one proton and one electron. It is a clean energy source, provided it is not produced with the use of fossil fuels. Actually has a negative net energy, though, at this point, because it is so expensive right now to actually do. So currently, hydrogen is not going to be the way we're going, but again, you may be able to get in on the ground floor, and maybe you can, if you can get hydrogen to be cheaper, then it could have a lot of benefits. So fuel cells combine hydrogen and oxygen to produce electricity and water vapor. That's the key to hydrogen. The byproduct is pure water, fresh water that could actually be used. So not only is electricity being produced by hydrogen, but you can produce water for people to drink and for crops to use to irrigate crops. So advantages of hydrogen as a fuel: eliminates most outdoor air pollution from burning fossil fuels, would greatly slow climate change and ocean acidification. So some challenges: hydrogen chemically locked in water and organic compounds. We got to get it out. It has a negative net energy right now because there are a lot of limitations, including the cost. Again, they are very costly, the fuel cells, and the carbon dioxide emissions depend on the method of the hydrogen production. So how is it done? Well, what happens is fuel cells take in hydrogen gas and separate the hydrogen's atoms, electrons, from the protons. Okay, so you have hydrogen, right? H2 goes in there. We separate the proton from the electron. The electrons, right, then flow through basically flow through a thin type of electrical wire, and then produces electricity, right? So the electrons go through here, go out, and basically there's your electricity, just like what happened in a wind turbine or something like that, where the electrons are moving through into the electrical grid. But excuse me, but the key here is that the protons, okay, are then combined with oxygen to produce water vapor, right? So they bring some oxygen in, just some air. You have these protons that go into that oxygen air, and now all of a sudden you have H2O, which is water vapor. That is the byproduct. So again, it's a great idea here. Taking hydrogen gas, separate the protons and the electrons. The electrons form electricity, go right out into a grid. The protons combine with oxygen in the air to produce water vapor, which then goes out, can be condensed, and could actually be used for drinking and for irrigation. So again, hydrogen could be, okay, the wave of the future. Advantages: can be produced from plentiful water at some sites, no carbon dioxide emissions if produced with use of renewable energy, good substitute for oil, high efficiency in fuel cells. Disadvantage: a net energy yield right now because it's so expensive to do. Carbon dioxide emissions if produced from carbon-containing compounds. High costs create needs for subsidies, which we're not seeing right now, and you need some kind of storage and distribution system for those, for the H2, for the hydrogen, right? That has to get into the system to actually produce the electricity and to produce the water vapor. But at the end of the day, maybe this is something, as the technology continues to increase, maybe hydrogen will be the way to produce not only electricity, but water down the road. All right, almost done here with chapter 15. How can we make the transition to a more sustainable energy future? Well, we need to reduce waste. We need to improve those energy efficiency, like we talked about in part 1 of this lecture. We need to use a mix of renewable energy resources, so maybe not only wind, maybe wind, solar, hydropower, etc. And we need to include the environmental and health costs of energy resources in their market prices, because then the non-renewable energy will become so expensive that we'd almost be forced to transition to renewable energy sources. So China and the United States are key players. Why? Because we have a lot of people and huge economies, key players in making the shift to a new set of energy resources. Each country uses about 20% of the world's energy, right? Us and China. So if we don't shift, it's not really going to make a difference, right? So us and China have to be the leaders here. Important actions to enable energy shift. Again, use that full cost pricing, and again, tax those carbon emissions, decrease and eliminate government subsidies for fossil fuels, give those subsidies to the renewable energy industry, establish a national feed-in tariff like they have in Germany, where people can actually create, if they buy solar panels for their roof, right, photovoltaic cells can actually reap the benefits by selling that energy to the local utility companies. Mandate that certain percentage of electricity generated by utility companies are from renewable resources, right? Mandate that, and increase government fuel efficiency standards. Also, we need environmental leadership. This is where you guys come in. Lead by example. Work within existing economic and political systems to bring about environmental improvement, buy sustainable products, and at the end of the day, run for local office. Other things you can do: walk, bike, use mass transit, drive only vehicles that get at least 40 miles per gallon, have an energy audit done, super insulate, use that passive solar heating. For cooling, open windows, use fans, use programmable thermostats, turn down your water heater if you can, turn off lights, computers, TVs when they're not in use, and wash laundry in cold water and dry it on racks. Don't use warm water. Don't use a dryer. Those are some of the things you can do to shift to a more sustainable energy use. Well, that concludes my lecture on Chapter 15, Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And as always, I thank you for listening.